This is version 31 of the competitive Brawl Stars tier list. And it's all possible because of these pro players who helped me create this tier list. This was not my own tier list, this is made by them. We're gonna rank every brawler from worst to best, let's go. First up is Edgar, staying in dead last. Edgar didn't get any changes, nobody got worse, and that means he's at the bottom. Fun to play in lower trophies, but very easy to avoid in competitive. And right behind him is Shelly. And this honestly shouldn't be a surprise either. She also did not get any changes, and honestly I don't see them changing Shelly because she's so strong in lower trophies, but competitively, she's really not very good. There are better tank stoppers. Also staying in the F tier is Jackie. She's our third brawler that's just the F tier seems to be very stagnant right now. She has little range, no good way for her to approach enemies since she has no changes since the last update. She's also staying in the F tier. Byron is moving from the D tier down into the F tier. Honestly, he's just been a bad brawler. In fact, I got a quest for him today. It was awful pushing him. It was really, really awful, right? He received some nerfs a while back and he's just been really awful since then. Up next to the D tier brawlers that are still also not very good. Starting us off, we have Bull. He's got really close range, but at least he has some sort of way to get close to enemies, even if it's not that great, and usually requires his gadget in order for his super to even be useful in the first place. He does have one of the highest DPSs in the game, especially for like maybe play him, but he's staying in the D tier, don't play him. Next is El Primo. He's just barely above Bull because they're very similar in DPS and range, but El Primo is a lot better than Bull's actually. It's not enough to make him significantly more competitive, but he at least can't be hit while he's in the air, so that's kind of useful. Up next, we have Jessie. Jessie received a small buff to her turret's health, but she still is staying in the D tier because it honestly has not made much of a difference for her and for how well her turret survives. She's still very easy to take out. Mr. P is moving from the F tier up into the D tier. This is mostly because of the damage buff to his main attack. Before, he was so weak that there was literally no use for him in competitive, but now there's like some rare situations where he's still awful, but he's at least not the worst option. Next is Frank, moving from the C tier down into the D tier. Buster, Chester, Gray, all of them have abilities that can interrupt attacks, and Frank is very weak to those abilities, so he is gradually just moving out of the meta, especially because all three of those brawlers are actually very strong right now. And staying in the D tier, we have Mortis. Lots of brawlers are really hard counters to Mortis, but there's also a few brawlers that Mortis is a really hard counter to, so he's not completely useless, but he's inconsistent at best and overall just not very good. Up next, we've got the C tier brawlers. These are ones that are very niche, maybe competitive in some rare situations, but usually not. And Dynamite is moving from the F tier all the way up into the C tier. This is all because of the buffs that was made to his attacks that make it actually a lot easier for him to actually hit his shots and deal damage to enemies, but it is very unfortunate because we have to say goodbye to the double jump. It's almost impossible to do a double jump successfully without his super, but the buff to his main attack has proven him to be a great, well, it's really great for Dynamite, it really is. Overall, he's significantly easier to hit shots with, and he's a little bit more viable now. And moving from the D tier up into the C tier is Colt. He also received a buff to his main attack, and while it hasn't made that much of a difference in comparison to Dynamite's has, it's definitely made Colt a little bit better to use. Next is BB, who is staying in the C tier. In fact, she's in the exact same spot as she was in the last tier list. She hasn't made any changes to her. The meta really hasn't made her any worse or better, so she's just kind of staying put. Next is Barley, moving from the B tier down into the C tier. A few of the other throwers in the game received some good buffs in the last update, and the better other throwers get, the less of a reason there is to choose Barley, even though he's still kind of a decent brawler. Tara is moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Tara's always been really good at countering tanks, but the top tier tanks right now currently have too much HP for Tara to actually hard counter them, and she's not great against other brawlers, which is why she struggles a little bit right now. Next is Nani, who's staying in the C tier. Now, Nani is pretty good on a few specific maps, especially on Knockout, but no real major changes have been made to her, and she usually doesn't move far up or down in the meta anyway. It's just really hard to hit your shots, especially against enemies who are really good at dodging, which is what happens in competitive matches. Sandy's moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Even though Sandy was one of the brawlers that received their mythic gears this update, he's actually moving down a little bit, right? His mythic gear didn't seem to make him any better, and kind of similar to Tara, Sandy really struggles against tanks because he just doesn't deal enough damage. Up next, we have the B tier brawlers. These brawlers are actually competitively, usually on the right mapper mode or with the right teammates or to counter specific enemies. And 8-Bit is moving from the C tier up into the B tier. It's not a huge change because he's at the bottom of the B tier, but he's moving up mostly just because a few brawlers that countered 8-Bit used to be very high in the previous meta. Since then, they've been nerfed, and now 8-Bit's just a little bit better against the current best brawlers. Also moving from the C tier up into the B tier is Rosa. Brawlers like Otis or Griff were both really good counters against tanks, and they both received some nerfs this update, so Rosa is actually a little bit more playable. Daryl's moving from the C tier up into the B tier. This is actually the same reasons that Rosa was moved up, right? Nerfs to tank counters have made them a little bit more viable, and also there are some tanky brawlers that Daryl, with his high DPS, can kind of work against a little bit. Next is Lou, who is staying in the B tier. He's still pretty good on some of maps, and he's good at countering certain comps, but his shots are still pretty difficult to land, and he remains kind of an average brawler. Nita is staying in the B tier as well. She used to only be good for heist, but ever since the buffs from a couple of updates ago, she's still not like the best, but she is playable in actually most game modes now. Next is Gale, moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Gale received a lot of different nerfs, and honestly, I'm actually surprised to see that he's at least in the B tier, right? Honestly, the reason why I think that he's still at least in the B tier is the fact that he's just so easy to use, and even though you can't use his attack or super as often anymore, they're still actually pretty strong. Next is Rico, who's staying in the B tier. Rico's a pretty basic brawler, but he's really good on maps that have lots of walls that you can bounce stuff around, right? Slowly but surely, brawlers are getting added into the game that can easily get rid of walls, so Rico's being played less. He's still like about as good as he was as the last tier list, so you can still consider him on the right maps. Next is Pam, who's staying in the B tier. Pam's another brawler that is very easy to use and just has overall good stats. She doesn't have any abilities that are overpowered, but she has range, she has damage, it's easy to hit her shots, plus she can actually heal, so she's a decent brawler in pretty much any game mode. Amber's moving from the A tier down into the B tier. She used to be in the A tier because of how well she countered the top tier brawlers, but now that the meta is very different, the best brawlers don't really have very much trouble with her, and she struggles. Next is Sprout, staying in the B tier. Sprout is kind of like Mortis because it's really easy to counter, but if you don't counter it, it can absolutely dominate the match. Sprout's a little bit more reliable than Mortis though because it has enough range to compete against most brawlers in the game. Also staying in the B tier, we have Leon. Very similar to Sandy, he received his mythic gear this update, but it hasn't really made that much of a difference with him, and with no balance changes, he's pretty much exactly where he was before the update. Next is Fang, staying in the B tier. He's not a bad close range brawler since he can quickly get to enemies with his super, but he's still exposed the whole time he's using it, and he's kind of always a little bit of a risky choice in competitive play. Sure, high risk, high reward, but sometimes the risk just isn't worth it. Also staying in the B tier is Ash. In fact, Ash, even though he works very different than Fang, they're kind of similar in the fact that they're both very aggressive brawlers and play very similar roles. Ash is just a very slightly better choice, but still he's not like hyper competitive at the moment. Next we have Bo, staying in the B tier. Honestly, Bo doesn't have anything that's just like makes him really amazing, but he also doesn't have any major weaknesses right now. He's kind of just like very consistent and solid, and like, but also there are better options at the moment. So most of the time you want to go with those better options, but sometimes he's great. Ems is also staying in the B tier. She doesn't play very well on open ranged maps against long range brawlers, but other than that, she doesn't have very many weaknesses, and she can be really good in the right situation. Next is Buzz, moving from the C tier up into the B tier. As I said before, some of the best brawlers in the game were very strong counters to tanks or assassins like Buzz, and after they got nerfed, that means that Buzz actually gets a little bit better. Next we have Tick, who is staying in the B tier. Tick honestly kind of doesn't have the DPS other throwers have, but his area control is just insane, and now he's probably the second best thrower in the game. Next is Brock, who's moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Brock is actually really good at countering throwers since he has plenty of range. He's great at breaking walls. Unfortunately, the current meta just kind of disfavors him for right now, but he is solid, just not the most competitive. And finally, at the very top of the B tier, we have Sam, who is staying in the B tier. In fact, he's actually moving from the very bottom of the B tier up into the very top of the B tier, and he still is not the best tank in the game, but he did receive a health buff that made him a little bit more usable, especially since it was also an indirect buff to his star power. And that means we are ready to move on to the A tier brawlers. These brawlers are very competitive, and you can play them in most situations. They're just not quite as competitive as the S tier brawlers. And starting off the bottom of the A tier, we have Surge, who is staying in the A tier. He is an extremely powerful brawler if he can get to level 3, and honestly, he's not even that bad at level 2. However, if he's ever in a situation where he can't get close to the enemy in order for him to level up in the first place, he is useless. And so he's not consistent enough for high A tier, but he is competitive enough for the A tier. Also staying in the A tier, we have Piper. She hasn't received any changes in a long time, and she's another brawler that is just getting slowly pushed down the tier list, as she was in the last tier list a little bit higher in the A tier. But as other brawlers get buffs and buffs, she struggles a little bit more and a little bit more. She's still competitive though. Next we have Lola, who's moving from the B tier up into the A tier. Honestly, Lola kind of got the best of both worlds after the balance changes, because the brawlers that she is bad against got nerfed, and the brawlers she's good against are at the top of the meta, so she's a really good counter pick. Next is Squeak, who's moving from the B tier up into the A tier. The last meta was a little bit too aggressive for Squeak, but now that it favors a little bit more longer range game, Squeak is a little bit more competitive now that he's so good at area control. Next is Meg, moving from the C tier, skipping the B tier and moving up into the A tier. She has actually benefited a ton from the way that this meta has shifted, even though she didn't receive any balance changes at all. She's one of the best brawlers in the game for Hot Zone right now, and that alone is enough to put her in the A tier. Next is Belle, who is staying in the A tier. Her super comes in handy when tanks are at the top tier, but even if there aren't tanks, her main attack keeps enemies away from grouping up, which was always useful, and it forces the enemy to move in a predictable way, which makes it easier for her to actually hit her shot. So she's really great. Eve is moving from the B tier up into the A tier. She got a buff to her attack a couple of updates ago, and immediately it didn't seem like she was that much stronger, but gradually she has risen up a little bit more in the meta. Next is Carl, who is staying in the A tier. He's got lots of health, lots of range. He can also act like an assassin with his flying hook gadget and his super, and as long as Carl doesn't have any major counters in the game, he will stay A tier for a very long time, unless he gets nerfed like crazy. He's just really good. Colette is also staying in the A tier. With some of the best tank counters receiving nerfs this update, not only did tanks move up in the meta a bit, but so did some of the other tank counters, and that includes Colette. She's actually really solid at the moment. Next is Colonel Ruffs, staying in the A tier. His super makes every brawler way stronger in every game mode and on every single map. In fact, he himself is strong enough to 1v1 most brawlers in the game, which is actually really solid for a support brawler. Next is Spike, who is staying in the A tier. Now, the changes in the meta actually made Spike a little bit less effective, but then you have his new mythic gear that actually made him a little bit more effective. So he's kind of staying about where he was last season. Next, we have Stu, who is staying in the A tier. He was a little bit higher in the previous tier list, and that's because no changes have been made to Stu, but brawlers with wide attacks are getting a little bit better, and Stu has a harder time dodging those. He's really good at countering enemies that have just like a single path of a projectile because he can dodge them so easily. So he's a little bit worse, but still very good. Next, we have Bonnie, who's moving from the S tier down into the A tier. She is very good against brawlers that cannot get away from her after she uses her super, but brawlers like Gray or Chester do have abilities that can easily avoid taking damage from her after she lands, and they are very dominant in the competitive meta right now, which is why she's moving down a tier. Also moving down is Janet, Bonnie's sister, moving from the S tier into the A tier. She didn't receive any balance changes, and the meta hasn't really made her a bad brawler by any means. She just doesn't quite feel as overpowered as she used to as players have gotten better at countering her. Oh man, Max is also moving from the S tier down into the A tier. Honestly, the biggest reason she's moved down as far as she did is because Crow is being played a lot more now, and he is a major counter against Max. Oh, my boy Poco is also moving from the S tier down into the A tier. And honestly, it's the same reason as Max. Like, Crow is such a good counter against Poco because he actually decreases the amount of healing that Poco is able to do, and that's what makes Poco so good. When one of your biggest counters is in the S tier, like Crow, it's hard for Poco to stay in the S tier himself. Next, we have Grom, who's moving from the C tier up into the A tier, and honestly, could have been S tier. Some pros said that he was S tier. His attack damage got buffed a couple updates ago, and it got buffed again, so he deals insane damage right now. Not only that, but they made his attacks easier to land by increasing the speed of his projectile, which has made him very dominant. Next is Griff, who's moving from the very top, the #1 spot in the S tier, down into the A tier, almost #1 in A tier. His super got nerfed, and it doesn't recharge his super as much, so he can't fire as many supers as he could before, and apparently that made a big difference because he's definitely not the best brawler in the game anymore. Next is Penny, who's staying... Oh, I've got the old icon for Penny. Well, there you go. Penny's staying in the A tier, and she's actually #1 in the A tier. She was already a high tier brawler, and her salty barrel actually seems to be a little bit more useful in this meta because of how well it blocks some attacks from some of the best brawlers in the game right now. And finally, we got the best of the best, the S tier brawlers, typically competitive in pretty much any map or mode against any brawler in any team comp. And starting us off is B, staying in the S tier. With how much range B has, she can deal with long range brawlers, but also she does a really great job at playing against close range brawlers. In fact, she is one of the best first draft picks that you can get because you really can't go wrong with her. And Crow is moving up from the A tier into the S tier. It seems that his new mythic gear has actually made a significant difference for him, and he's a great counter to a lot of brawlers in the game. He's very competitive at the moment. Next is Gene, moving from the A tier up into the S tier. Without a doubt, this is because his mythic gear got buffed for the full extra tile. This made Gene go from being a good brawler to one of the very best in the game. Next, we have Gray, who is starting out in the S tier. Obviously, it's been less than a month since he was released, so the pros are still figuring him out, but like, especially after they've released his second gadget, the pros cannot disagree. He is absolutely S tier, and they actually placed him before his second gadget was released, which is just ridiculous because both his second gadget and his second star power make him even better. But even better is Chester, starting in the S tier. He currently has the most burst damage with 3 attacks in the entire game, and he's not even a close range brawler. On top of that, the enemy team is never going to know which super he's planning to use, so instead of being able to play around him, you kind of have to play around the worst case scenario, which really forces the enemy back and gives him a crazy advantage. Next, we have Gus moving from the A tier up into the S tier, the 3rd best brawler in the game at the moment. Gus was already a great brawler in 1v1s, and the way that the meta has shifted, he can 1v1 against the top brawlers even better than he could before. Plus, he's always so great at providing support, especially for the competitive players who are able to easily land his super and help his teammates. Next, we have Otis staying in the S tier, and he's staying in the exact same spot as before. Somehow, the second second best brawler in the game, even after getting a little bit of a nerf. He has really good range, his shots are very easy to land, but more importantly than that, his super completely shuts down aggressive plays from the enemy team, so he can actually ruin entire strategies just by himself. And somehow, even better than Otis, we have him moving from the A tier is Buster in the S tier, the very top of the meta. And we'll talk about Mandy in just a minute where I think she's going to be. But by the time I actually released the previous tier list, Buster's second gadget had not been released, and that second gadget made him just incredibly strong. Buster's too good. He's really good. I am expecting several nerfs. Even though he already got nerfed in quite a few ways, he's still the strongest brawler in the game. Now, up next, we have Mandy. Now, the pros did not talk about Mandy because she's not released yet, and most of them have not had a chance to play her in the developer build. So take this with a very big grain of salt. I am putting her at the very bottom of the A tier myself. That's my opinion alone. In my personal opinion, Mandy just standing still in order for her to increase her range is too gimmicky at the moment. At least it feels too gimmicky in my experience playing against bots, which is not very much experience. I do think she'll be good, and if she's really terrible, I fully expect Supercell to buff her, but that's my opinion for right now. We'll have to see because she actually could be a monster. And there we have the tier list. Make sure if you do share this anywhere, not to cut out my face. That's a good screenshot for you right there. And I would also appreciate you guys giving credit to the pros who put this tier list together. I did not put this together. In fact, I didn't even have a say in where anything went. So if you disagree with anything, it is not my fault. But if you do agree with everything, well, okay, it's still the pros credit for sure. Either way, let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below, and make sure you subscribe for future tier lists because I'm doing this every single season, and check out my other awesome content right here. For now, this is KairosTime ticking by. We will see you in Brawl Stars.